In this lecture, we will learn about the number theoretic and representation functions that the Python math module gives us access to. Up at the top of the program, we will import the math module by typing import math. The ceil function allows us to round up a number regardless of the decimal value. For example, let's print out math.ceil and pass in the float 2.3. Normally, 2.3 should be rounded down to 2, since the decimal value 3 is closer to 2 than 3. However, with the ceil function, we are telling Python to round the float up to the nearest value. In this case, when we run the code, you will notice that 2.3 was rounded up to the integer value 3. The copy sign function takes in two parameters. The first is the value that it will keep. The second is the sign. For example, we can print out math.copySign and pass in 2.5 as the first argument and -1 as the second argument. When we run the code, you will notice that -2.5 was printed to the console. The fabs function allows us to get the absolute value for the number we pass in. For example, we will print out math.fabs and pass in -1.0. When we run the code, you will notice that 1.0 was printed to the Pycharm console. The factorial function will give us the factorial of the number that we pass in. For example, we can print out math.factorial and pass in 3 to get the factorial of 3. Remember that a factorial means we would multiply the 3 by 2 by 1, which results in a value of 6. When we run the code, you will notice that 6 was printed, which is the factorial of 3. The opposite of the ceil function we learned about earlier is the floor function, which will round down a float to an integer regardless of the decimal value. Usually 3.9 would be rounded up to 4, but since we are using the floor function, it will be rounded down to 3. When we run the code, you will notice that 3 was printed to the Pycharm console. Another useful function that the math module gives us access to is the fsum function. This function allows us to get the sum of a sequence of numbers inside of a collection. For example, let's use the fsum function and print out the sum of a list with the values 1, 2, 3, and 4. When we run the code, you will notice that 10 was printed to the console. GCD stands for greatest common denominator, the greatest number that both numbers can be divided by. Python's math module provides us the GCD function that takes in two parameters, the two numbers we want the greatest common denominator of. For example, let's use the GCD function and pass in 3 as the first argument and 6 as the second argument. When we run the code, you will notice that 3 was printed to the Pycharm console. Another common mathematical operation is to get the square root of a number. The math module gives us the sqrt function to obtain a number's square root. For example, let's print out the square root of 25. When we run the code, you will notice that 5 was printed to the Pycharm console. In the next lecture, we will learn about the power and logarithmic functions that the Python math module gives us access to.